Hello, welcome to the West Virginia Author Show. I am your host, Kat Pleska. Today I have a novelist with me, so Tony Viola, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I'm glad to have you here with me. So you were not born in West Virginia, but you got here as soon as you could, right? So tell us a little bit about where you're from and how you got here.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for inviting me on the show.
Certainly.
I was born and raised in Long Island, New York.
Oh.
And I started taking some college classes when I was in my late teens, early 20s. Mm-hmm. And then I decided to pursue a degree in English. Mm-hmm. And at the time, my parents were relocating to northeastern Pennsylvania. And I applied to schools just throughout the country and then to 2 schools in that general area of northeastern Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. So I was accepted. I wound up getting my degree. Mm-hmm. And as I was finishing up my bachelor's, one of my English professors suggested I go on to graduate school. I never crossed my mind.
But that's what we do.
Yes, I've done the
recruit.
same. I'm a professor myself, so I have done the same thing to some of my students.
Yes.
Then I applied, and I wound up getting a assistantship at University of North Dakota, and went there for 2 years, and then took about a year off because it was tough to try and finish up my master's and apply for PhD programs, mm-hmm. and also study for the GRE.
Right.
So then I did do that, and I applied to Ohio University in Athens, not far from here. Mm-hmm. Got accepted. I applied to other schools, but that was the best offer. Mm-hmm. I was there for 4 years, got my PhD, did a postdoctoral position for 1 year, went on the job market, and then landed a 2-year position at University of Kentucky.
Okay.
It was a teaching administration position. I was the associate director of the writing program.
Okay.
And then, well, within 2 years, I had to go back on the job market again, and I applied to several places, and one was Marshall University.
Yeah, and here you are. You
Yes.
are a colleague of mine in the English department.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So tell me, how long have you been at Marshall?
This is the start of my 19th year.
Okay, that's a long time.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
So I bet you've acclimated to West Virginia by now, right?
Yes, yes, I have.
And we're nowhere near as cold as North Dakota, at least not yet.
No, no.
I bet you moved south just to get warm again, right?
I was not upset when I found out that the temperature can warm up in February, or because that does not happen in North Dakota.
Right, right. Lovely state, but it's a little chilly. Yes. So, so tell me what subjects do you teach? I know you teach English and writing, but what specifically do you teach there?
Well, I teach all levels. I can teach first-year composition, advanced mm-hmm. composition, even some graduate level classes, mm-hmm. introductory literature classes. I think the introductory literature classes tend to be my favorite because I think students come in and they're not quite sure what this class is about.
Yeah.
And I typically teach like an introduction to novel or introduction to short stories, since fiction is my primary area. Mm-hmm. Every once in a while, I'll teach a specialized course. Like I've taught a course on minimalism. It's a literary aesthetic, and I studied that when I was at Ohio University, and it's influenced my writing. So I've taught that, and I've taught that on the grad level primarily. Mm-hmm. And there was another course that I really like to teach. It doesn't generate as much interest anymore. Mm-hmm. We at Marshall, we used to have exams. And so students would have to do a portfolio and exams. Mm-hmm. We got rid of that. Exams are an option. And I used to teach history of the American short story, which would then qualify as an exam question. Oh. So students would take that, and then they would be prepared to answer a question on the short story. And I liked it. What I liked most about that course is I liked tracing the roots of the short story its origins and to see how far it's come and how it's evolved into what it is now.
Well, how far back just a ballpark idea of when it's been identified, when the first short stories started coming along?
Well, I just went over this in one of my classes the other day. The first short story, the first print American short story is considered to be Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle.
Oh.
And it was published around 1819, 1820.
Oh, wow.
What I like to do is I like to start with some American history and European history and explain to the students that when the United States was trying to form as a country, Europe was flourishing writing literature. However, the United States had to focus on other things. So that Washington Irving's is considered to be, that's the first print short story, which makes the short story a relatively young genre.
It actually does.
Just over 200 years old.
I'm an personal essayist. I know you also write essays, but that's been traced back to Seneca, Greek back in 300 and some.
Yeah.
BC. So it is pretty young form. So when did you know you wanted to be a writer?
I knew at a very young age. I recall, I believe I was in the 4th grade. And we didn't have official guidance counselors. We just had someone that came by and I think just visited with us. And I had to fill out a form. And I barely remember what the questions were, except one of the questions was, what do you want to be when you're an adult or when you grow up? And I wrote science fiction writer. And the only reason why I remember that is because the guidance counselor was impressed that it was very specific.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was primarily because not so much of reading a lot of science fiction, but watching a lot of science fiction.
Yeah.
And it just the wonder and the awe of that genre just inspired my creativity.
Okay. Are there any other writers in your family?
No, there are no other writers. No.
Nobody's pursued that even as a hobby or nothing like that. You're the breakout.
I'm the breakout. Other than my older sister, I would be
Okay.
the first of my family to go to college.
Okay. First gen, they call
My
it.
sister was the first to get a master's. I was the first to get a PhD.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good. So, what writers do you like to read now?
I've been reading a lot of anthologies that I've been preparing for some of my classes. So every once in a while, I'll find something in one of these anthologies that I'm like, this is a really good story, and then I'll find the author's book, and then read that. But in the past, I think the '90s and the early 2000s, when I was really immersed in new authors, because that's when I was getting my PhD, so I was reading as much as I could. But if we go all the way back to like William Faulkner, I enjoy for his novels. I've read some Cormac McCarthy. Now when it comes to short fiction, I like Amy Hempel, who is a minimalist.
I do like her.
She's very, very, very good. And there's also Mary Robeson, who I had the opportunity to meet.
Oh,
I also had the opportunity to meet Amy Hempel too.
Oh, okay.
When I was at Ohio University, we had the visiting writers, and they would come down. And Barry Hannah was there too, so I would read a lot of those 1970s, 1980s short story writers. So.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sounds good. And anthologies, I think, as I'm the editor of 4 anthologies, I think they're often way too much overlooked. There are gems in those collections, I think, that people miss. They think, well, I don't want to read different people on it, but that's not the point. I think is to find good writing. You're welcome to find them in an anthology.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about your first book, The Art of Death, which is a really intriguing title. There's the art of war, the art of, everything. So The Art of Death. So tell us a little bit about what that book is about.
Sure. There's also the art of, is it Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance?
Yeah.
That wasn't the original title. The original title was called What We Did, because it was written in first person at one point. Then I switched it to third person, and it became What They Did.
Okay.
And then I decided to to change the title to The Art of Death. And it is about someone in their 40s, and I was around 40 years old when I first came up with the idea. Well, actually, I was a little younger than 40. And he is working as a correctional officer at Rikers Island, and he's very alienated from himself because the work environment at Rikers is very, very dismal and traumatizing. And he believes he's rented a video, a VHS, because this takes place in like 2003 or so. And he believes he sees what is a snuff film.
Oh,
And
yikes.
And then as he's watching it, it becomes more and more familiar to him. And he actually recalls that when he was younger, he was a film editor. And he had worked with a low-budget film company. And the film that he was just, saw in 2003 was a film he had edited 20 years later.
Okay.
But it was a memory so far in the past that he tried to bury it and forget all about that it wasn't quite clear. And as he's watching it, it's beginning to, he's beginning to understand that, wait, I actually, edited this. And at the time, he was not sure if it was an authentic snuff film or if it was fake, because they had done a lot of fake snuff films. So
Yeah. How'd you come up with that idea?
it was based on a short story,
Okay.
and I decided to just play around and expand with it to see if I could actually make it into a novel. And the idea for the short story came from a science fiction film
Okay.
that I had watched when I was young.
Inspiration.
Yeah, I had watched when I was younger, and I had forgotten all about this one particular scene. This is again the 90s when video stores were out, coming out, and I saw a copy of this videotape called A Boy and His Dog, which starred Don Johnson, I think, in his first film.
Oh, wow.
And it was a post-apocalyptic, and supposedly him and his dog, because they speak telepathically, the dog does something where he gets rewarded. He wants to go to the movies, and it's a very sort of makeshift civilization. So there's a tent and some people watching movies, and people are paying like a can of food to see the movies. And I'm thinking, okay, and then once I saw the movies, they were snuff films.
Oh.
And somehow, somehow that did not register when I was a kid.
Yeah, well, no, probably not.
And it did register when I was much older, and it actually, I would say, it traumatized me for about
It could.
2 days.
I could see.
And I
Yeah.
had to exorcise that, so I started writing about it.
Okay, that's very intriguing. And I'm sure the murder is solved at the end of that, if there was one, right? Well, let's go ahead and talk about your second book, All Lies Begin with the Truth. And so tell us a little bit about that, and then I'd like for you to read a little bit of it.
Sure. All Lies Begin with Truth it takes place in a fictional town, West York, Kentucky, which is based off of Uniontown and Henderson, more Uniontown than Henderson. It involves a town that has had a history of a coal mining company coming in and buying the mineral rights to the local mountain so they could mine it. And they abandoned longwall mining and decided to do mountaintop removal and strip mining. And the townspeople don't understand really what that means. And then they find out eventually that the company has created a lot of ecological havoc. And they've scooped up most of this coal that they can get, and they've already left town. And there's no legal recourse because they're working under a shell corporation. So they just file for bankruptcy, and there's no way to get any type of retribution for the damage that they did. So they go in and they destroy the environment, so to speak. They cause a lot of problems with the blasting. That it disrupts the foundations of the houses, and it causes some PTSD with some of the townspeople. And then they also have a improperly manufactured slurry impoundment, which leaches into the water system, and that causes cancer.
Yeah.
So this town is devastated by this, and it sets them on an economic decline. And then the way the story begins, the novel begins, another energy company has come into town. This time it's a gas company. And they are surveying the area because in that area, and I looked this up, underneath that area is the New Albany Shale Basin.
Fracking.
And underneath that is all the natural
All the
gas that
natural gas.
you can want.
Yeah.
So their goal is to frack the shale basin and
Yeah.
extract all the natural gas.
Well, we won't tell the end of the story. We want people to read that book.
That's true.
Because it's very germane. I mean, you did research, and it's,
Yes, I did.
it's very current, and still things we're still dealing with. So why don't you read
Sure.
a page or two for us from that book, All Lies Begin with the Truth,
Okay.
which is an interesting title, too.
Yeah, a lot of teaching Winesburg, Ohio, has definitely influenced this book. So.
Okay.
So I'm going to be reading chapter 3. This book is divided into 3 different sections
Okay.
from different characters, and this is from Lionel Boone, who is someone who has survived a Kettle Bottom mine collapse.
Yes.
And from the original, like back in the days when they did longwall mining.
Right.
And he actually discovers the surveying crew, and he's the one who tries to get activists into town and to try and stop things.
Okay.
If you don't notice this, you might notice this eventually. You might recognize some names. I've used all 120 counties of Kentucky
Oh, my.
as
That's quite a
character
list.
names,
Oh, okay.
business names.
Okay, cool.
And Boone is obviously
Yep.
a county. So this takes place in June 2014. Lionel Thaddeus Boone sat in the cab of his beat-up 1991 F-150, windows rolled up, AC blasting. He was parked just outside of Brackenfield Cemetery, where his wife, Lauren, had been buried 11 years ago. To this day, he never visited the grave, even though he promised himself every year he would. It was easy to make promises if no one else knew about them. It was also easy when the promise was weeks away, even a month. No immediacy present, so it felt like it wasn't real. And it was easy to justify breaking that promise. No, renegotiating it. When your anxiety crept up, increasing as the moment loomed closer, eventually paralyzing you. Visiting his wife's grave would mean he would have to visit the graves of his parents, his older brother, his brother-in-law, and all his friends and co-workers who died too young in the Marshall Coal mine collapse of 1994. Every time he passed the cemetery, Boone felt the presence of death. At 54, he felt it creeping up on him, catcalling his consciousness, especially when peering into the cemetery entrance, its narrowing roadway overcrowded by sumac, possum holly, and switch cane, its rusted iron gates permanently cast open like a mouth waiting to feed. Gears grinded as he shifted into drive. Over the last few years, more and more parts of his truck had deteriorated. The motor was still in good condition. It had nearly 150,000 miles, but Boone brought it regularly to Lloyd Green's Amoco and made sure the oil was changed at least twice a year, the transmission flushed, along with frequent tune-ups and front-end alignments. However, it was the oxidation that began to wear down the body and frame, and now the axles and the rotors were showing signs of weathering. He spun the truck around and headed west on State Road 268, back into the town of West York, Kentucky. He passed the remains of the old Rowan Drive-In. A few white pickup trucks were parked on the grounds near the 20-foot neon sign. A half a mile later, the road curved north. Boone passed the Breckenridge Trailer Park. Up ahead were more trailers, and as he got closer to the downtown district, houses. He pulled to a stop at 2nd Avenue, parallel to the Cumberland grain plant, and turned left, slowly making his way to the other side of town, driving parallel to the flood wall 1 block north. Just beyond the flood wall was the Ohio River. West of the river was Indiana, and a few miles south stood the majestic Shawnee Forest, its rows of royal green oak and hickory positioned like nature's centuries on the bottom edge of Illinois. West York, whose population once peaked at 3,800, but was now below 3,300, found itself to be a flagship town in a tri-state area where it shared the norms and beliefs of their home state while adopting the values and principles of others, rendering the residents connected, yet separate from their indigenous neighbors. I'll just stop there.
Yeah, excellent. Sounds
Thanks.
really intriguing. I like
Thank
that. Well, let's move on to your most latest book, so we'll have time to read a page from that.
Okay.
The Law of Devil's Land. And so tell us very briefly about that, and then please read one page from that.
Sure. The Law of Devil's Land was an idea I've had since the early 1990s.
Wow.
It was one of those, when I said earlier I wanted to be a science fiction writer,
Yeah.
I came up with all these different ideas. I had like well over 20 of them.
Wow.
And I would sit down and try and write them, and nothing would happen.
Oh.
So I put it aside. I tried to write it in about 2011, 2012. Didn't work. Got a little bit done, didn't work. And then 2020, I picked up the idea again and started writing it. And it's a post-apocalyptic dystopian, and I decided to make it young adult. And it's based on a non-binary protagonist. He's they are 17 years old. And it's similar to the Hunger Games and Divergent, but I will add that I had the idea back in 1990s.
Right.
And
If only had brought it to a producer.
I know. Well, you know,
Yeah.
Suzanne Collins has been writing for decades, and she's a fantastic writer, so good for her.
Yeah.
And so it deals with there's this thing called the Imperial events. It's like the Olympics and gladiator, combat, and also the X Games. If you've ever seen like the X Games, and what it is, it's a distraction, created by the government to keep the people in line, so
Yep.
they're happy, and then the government gets to exploit them the other
Right.
days of the year.
Familiar story.
Yeah. So it takes place over several days, and the main character, his name is Jonna Guile. Their name is Jonna Guile, and he participates. He's nominated, and he finds out later that his nomination was not accidental, and that there's a history of his family being involved, and his father was nominated, and his father was recruited by a underground sort of rebel movement, and that same movement has recruited him, and he's just he finds that out as he goes along.
Okay.
So he has to go through all the different stages.
Right.
And the prize is, and this is what some people have laughed at, the prize is a civil servant position.
The irony of that.
but having a civil servant's position in this time period
Yep.
is actually better, because he's in the lower ranks. And if you're a civil servant, then you're out of the lower ranks.
I see.
And then the next level is the overlord.
Right.
And they make all the rules.
Okay, hierarchies.
Yeah.
Okay, just read one page, please.
Yeah, sure. This is the beginning, and this is sort of like a monologue from their perspective, and explains what it means, or how he's discovering that he's non-binary.
Okay.
Because if we're dealing with a post-apocalyptic society that follows traditional values, it's not, the whole idea of non-binary is an alien concept.
Okay.
I was labeled male at birth, but I don't fully identify. Sure, I have what I've been told are masculine features: my height, my broad shoulders, and my prominent forehead. These are all physical attributes I inherited from my father. But my facial structure, my hair color, and my gait, how I present myself, come across as more feminine. I have deep blue eyes and straw-colored straight hair just past my shoulders. I have fuller lips, rounder cheekbones, a small curve at the tip of my nose, and a soft complexion. I resemble my mother in this way. It's as if my outer appearance reflects who I really am inside, non-committed, open to interpretation, open to whatever desires stem from my true self. I don't think in binaries. I never have. As a result, people are afraid of me. My mother told me it's not my fault, it's theirs. I receive odd looks, stares. In the eye of some, I see disdain. These are the people who treat me as less than human. In the eyes of others, I see relief. They are the ones who are thankful they're not me. They treat me with caution, as if I'm infectious, and they fear the more they are near me, the more they will look like me, be like me. And there are the few that see past all that, and those are the ones I feel comfortable exposing myself to. And then after that, it starts off with the action and the narration.
Sure. So what's been your audience's reaction to this genre of novel?
Well, a couple of people, mostly other writers, have said that it's a nice change, change of pace to see a young adult hero be sort of cast in a different from a different sort of background, so to speak. I don't think this is. I wouldn't claim that Jana Guile is a full representative of the LGBTQ plus community.
No.
But I kind of identified with him because I don't really think in binaries either. I never even realized I didn't think in binaries until much later in life when I said, well, it's not all. It can't be all this way. It can't be all that way. There's got to be some sort of middle ground.
Sure.
So, but I think there's been some positive reaction to see that there's someone that he doesn't represent like a dominant sort of cultural trend or whatever
Right.
in our time period.
Okay, good. Well, so what are you working on now?
Right now, I'm working on a pre-dystopian.
Pre-dystopian?
Yeah, I have to
Is
explain
that a term? I don't know.
It's something that I've been calling it, and what it is, it's one could argue it could be like the times that we are in right now,
Yeah.
where we are transitioning towards something that is clearly not what we had intended.
Right.
And it's about a privatized city. So a bunch of investors get together and they create a privatized city out in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And their goal is to have all the needs and amenities and desires met for the citizens. And it's a huge building. And I found out in my research that there's actually something like this, I think somewhere in Asia, maybe Taiwan.
I think so. I think I've read about that.
Yeah.
Everything is included. That
Yeah.
They don't need to leave the building.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
the whole point. However, like anything else, like any type of urban experiment, starts off great, and then it starts to,
It's never going to work.
yeah.
It's never going to work. Absolutely not. Okay, so how far along on that work are you?
I have it loosely sketched out where there's going to be 10 sections or 10 chapters and about 5 sections within each chapter.
Oh, okay.
And even though I've written some of the earlier ones, they're still rough. I have to go back and change things. And whenever I write, I just make notes and say, okay, even though I'm technically done with chapter 3, there's this, this, and this I have to address. But I am just finished chapter 7.
Okay. So you're moving right along on
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So do you plan out your time on a regular basis to write?
Normally,
Or is it whenever you can.
my routine in the morning is I'm up at 5:30, and you can thank one of my previous cats for that.
Oh.
I wake up at 5:30 all the time, and I get up, I stretch, I make coffee, I feed the cats, and then I sit in front of the computer and I
Okay.
writ for about 40 minutes.
All right.
45
Speaking
minutes.
of cats, I ask everybody that if I know they have pets, list their names, your cat's names.
Well, I have Lena, who is named after my paternal grandmother, and I have Francis, aka Frankie. He was named after my maternal grandmother.
Okay. All right. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you, Tony, for being on the show. I really appreciate
you.
it. Love to hear about your different novels and that you got a new one coming up and sounds very intriguing.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me, Kat.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So, folks, that's another show wrapped. Thank you for tuning in and watching. I'm Kat Pleska, your host, and this is the West Virginia Author Show.